My name is Alicia Collins, and at 27 years old, I am a sergeant in the United States Army. I thought nothing on the battlefield could ever break me, but I was wrong. The deepest pain came from my own parents' living room. I will never forget the sound of my father, Edwin's voice, as he roared at me in front of my grandmother. "You're just a grunt, don't you dare lecture me. That house is my reputation, not a place for someone like you." My mother, Marilyn, stood beside him, smoothing the sleeve of her silk blouse and adding with a sneer, "Look at yourself, Alicia. Your skin is sun-damaged, your hands are calloused. You don't belong in this world." That feeling of being rejected by the very people who gave you life because you weren't glamorous enough. It hurt more than 1,000 knives. They despised me, but they didn't know that inside my grandmother's old lockbox was a secret powerful enough to level the entire false empire they had built. If you're watching, let me know where you're from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family. And if you believe that sacrifice must, eventually, be met with justice. The miles of barren Arizona desert felt like they were melting away behind me, the monotonous brown landscape finally surrendering to the green glow of the Phoenix suburbs. My old Ford F-150 hummed along the 101 loop, its engine a familiar, steady companion on the last leg of a journey I'd been counting down for 6 excruciating months. On the radio, Bing Crosby was crooning about being home for Christmas, and I let the warmth of the melody sink into my bones. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was letting my shoulders relax, easing the rigid posture drilled into me at the base. In my mind, I was already there. I could practically taste the rich, spiced eggnog my mother always made, the steam warming my face. I could feel the heavy, slightly awkward pat on the shoulder from my father, his gruff, unspoken way of saying he was proud. For this one precious week of leave, I wouldn't be Sergeant Collins. I wouldn't be in charge of anyone or responsible for anything other than showing up. I would just be their daughter. The exit for Paradise Valley appeared, and I steered the truck onto the winding, palm-lined streets. Each sprawling mansion seemed to compete with the next, their manicured lawns and towering facades bathed in the soft glow of twilight. A familiar swell of pride rose in my chest as I turned onto our street. At the very end, our family's 5-story mansion stood as the ultimate symbol of their success. It was a testament to the Collins name, a landmark that had always made me feel like I was part of something grand, something permanent. Tucked safely in the passenger seat was a small, carefully wrapped gift, a digital photo frame preloaded with hundreds of pictures from my training exercises. It was my attempt to bridge the gap, to show them the world I lived in, a world of sweat, discipline, and camaraderie that felt a million miles away from this oasis of luxury. I pulled into the long, curved driveway, my heart thumping with anticipation. But as the truck's engine died, the silence that followed was heavy and wrong. My heart didn't just slow down, it sank. The house, which on Christmas Eve should have been a glorious beacon of light, a testament to my mother's love for extravagant decorations, was submerged in an unnerving, absolute darkness. Not a single string of lights lined the roof. Not a single welcoming lamp glowed in a window. There was only the cold, indifferent moonlight washing over the stark white walls, making the mansion look less like a home and more like a mausoleum. A chill, completely unrelated to the evening air, snaked its way up my spine. They're probably just trying to surprise me, I told myself, the thought feeling thin and hollow even in my own mind. I swung myself out of the truck, my boots crunching on the pristine gravel. I pressed the doorbell, and the ornate chime echoed once before being swallowed by the oppressive quiet. I waited. Nothing. I pressed it again, holding it down longer this time. Silence was the only answer. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother's number. It rang once, twice, a third time, and then a cold, definitive click. The call had been disconnected, rejected. It wasn't that she didn't hear it, it was that she had seen my name and deliberately silenced me. A moment later, my phone buzzed with an automated text message. "I'm busy right now. We'll call you back later." The impersonal, sterile words felt like a slap in the face, A wave of raw, brutal rejection washed over me, so potent it left me breathless. It was worse than no answer. It was a clear, calculated message. You are not welcome here. An hour bled into the next. I was huddled on the top step of the grand entryway, the cold of the Italian marble seeping through my uniform pants, chilling me to the bone. The desert wind, which always seemed to bite harder after the sun went down, whipped around the corner of the house, making me shiver uncontrollably. From just over the high, ivy-covered wall to my right, the neighbor's house was alive with a joyful Christmas party. Laughter spilled into the night air, punctuated by the clinking of glasses. The faint, unmistakable melody of White Christmas drifted over, each cheerful note a tiny, sharp needle piercing my solitude. I am a soldier. I've been trained to endure physical hardship, to push through pain, to operate on sheer willpower when my body is screaming to quit. I've slept in freezing mud and marched under a relentless sun. But this was a different kind of torture, one no training could prepare you for. To be locked out of your own home by your own family on Christmas Eve. It was an agony that settled deep in my chest, a heavy, suffocating weight. I felt erased, invisible, a ghost haunting a life I was no longer a part of. A bitter lump formed in my throat, so tight and painful that it choked back the tears before they could even form. All I could do was sit there, wrapped in a darkness that felt as infinite as the night sky, and tremble. It was in that moment of absolute despair, when the cold had made my limbs feel numb and my spirit hollow, that an image flashed in my mind, unbidden. The old house on Cactus Wren Road, the small brick ranch-style home we lived in before my father's business took off. I saw the brick fireplace, the one my dad used to hang our stockings on. I could almost smell the gingerbread cookies my mom would bake, their scent filling every room. The memory was a flicker of warmth in the suffocating cold. A wild, illogical hope sparked within me. Maybe, just maybe, they were there. Maybe this was the real surprise, a return to simpler times, a nostalgic Christmas waiting just for me. It was a drowning person's grasp for a piece of driftwood, but it was all I had. I pushed myself to my feet, my muscles stiff and protesting. There were no other options left. I had to find an answer, or at the very least, find some echo of warmth from my past to fight off the ice that was creeping into my soul. With one last look at the cold, imposing mansion, a symbol of wealth, and now, of betrayal, I turned my back and walked toward my truck. The wheels of my F-150 rolled away from the sterile perfection of Paradise Valley, leaving the silent, darkened mansions behind. I headed north, toward the older, more grounded neighborhoods of Scottsdale, where the streets were simpler and the houses sat closer together, as if sharing in each other's warmth. The address was burned into my memory, 47 Cactus Wren Road. It was a humble name for a humble street, tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was the last place I could think of that ever truly felt like home. From the end of the street, I saw it, a single, soft yellow light glowing through a front window. My breath caught in my chest, and my heart, which had felt like a block of ice, began to beat faster, a frantic rhythm of hope against my ribs. They're here. They're really here. The thought was a lifeline, but as I pulled up to the curb, a new kind of unease settled in. The house looked desolate. There were no Christmas decorations, not even a simple wreath on the door. The single bare bulb hanging from the living room ceiling cast long, lonely shadows, giving the place a temporary, almost transient feel. Still, it was the only light I had found in the darkness of this night, and I clung to it. I parked the truck and took a deep, steadying breath, the kind I take before a difficult training exercise. My hands, so accustomed to the steady weight of a rifle, felt unsteady, almost clumsy, as they reached for the familiar wooden door. It swung open with a faint creak. The space inside was eerily quiet. The living room was almost completely empty, stripped of the comforting clutter I remembered. And in the middle of that sparse room stood my parents, Edwin, and Marilyn. The expressions on their faces were not joy, not relief, not even surprise. It was sheer, unadulterated horror. They looked at me as if they had just seen a ghost. And then, from a small dining table set off to the side, a small figure turned. My world stopped. It was my grandmother, Helena. The same sharp, intelligent eyes, the same gentle but determined set of her jaw. My grandmother, who I had been told moved to Vermont to live with my Uncle Holden a decade ago. Grandma. The word was a whisper, a fragile breath of disbelief. All the discipline, all the carefully constructed walls of the tough army sergeant crumbled into dust. A raw, childlike sob tore its way from my chest. I rushed forward, closing the distance between us, and threw my arms around her. I buried my face in the crook of her thin, bony shoulder and wept, great, heaving sobs of grief and relief and 10 years of pent-up sorrow. The familiar, comforting scent of lavender filled my senses, and her warm, solid embrace seemed to melt away a decade of lies and aching distance. For a moment, nothing else mattered. I was home. But the moment couldn't last. As the storm of emotion subsided, a chilling awareness of the room settled back in. My parents were still standing frozen in place, like statues in a museum of familial dread. My father's face was ashen, drained of all color. My mother was trying, and failing, to assemble her features into a welcoming smile, but it was a trembling, brittle thing that didn't reach her terrified eyes. Alicia? What are you doing here? My father stammered, the words tumbling out of his mouth. My grandmother, without breaking her gaze from my parents, pulled me gently toward the table and had me sit down. Her eyes, when they finally turned to me, were filled with a fierce, protective love. She took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. Her thumb traced the thick calluses on my palms and knuckles. "These hands have protected our country," she said, her voice soft but clear, each word a balm on my wounded spirit. "I am so proud of them." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother flinch, her gaze flicking to my hands with an expression of pure disgust before quickly looking away. The contrast was so sharp, so brutal, it felt like a physical blow. My grandmother ignored them completely, her focus entirely on me. She asked about my life in the service, about the challenges, about the small joys. Her questions were genuine, her interest real. It felt as if the room had been split in two. On one side was our small island of warmth and connection. On the other, my parents sat stiffly on a worn-out sofa, a palpable fear radiating from them, so thick I could almost taste it. I felt a storm gathering, right there in that quiet, empty room. "Your grandmother missed you so much, she flew all the way from Vermont to surprise you," Marilyn chirped, her voice unnaturally high. The lie was clumsy, desperate. Helena cut her off, not with anger, but with a calm, unshakable authority that commanded the entire room. "I have never lived in Vermont, Alicia," she said, her eyes locked on mine. "I live in Sedona. It's a 2-hour drive from here. Your parents have been lying to you." The words didn't just land, they detonated. They shattered the fragile piece of our reunion and ripped a hole in the fabric of my reality. 10 years. For 10 years, I believed she was on the other side of the country. For 10 years, I'd sent Christmas cards and birthday wishes to an address in Vermont, wondering why I never heard back, blaming the mail, blaming her age, blaming everything but the truth. It was all a lie. A calculated, cruel, decade-long lie. I slowly turned my head to look at my parents. They wouldn't meet my gaze. My father was staring intently at a scuff mark on the floor, my mother examining her perfectly manicured nails. They were criminals caught in the act, their guilt a suffocating presence in the room. The first shock of the night was a locked door, a physical barrier. This was infinitely worse. This shock revealed that the very foundation of my life, the truth of my own family, was built on nothing but rotten wood. I have to pause here for a second. If you've ever discovered a lie that completely changed how you saw your own family, please support Helena's quest for truth by hitting the like button. And in the comments, just type a simple Team Helena to let me know you're with us. It means more than you know. In a desperate attempt to stitch the unraveling evening back together, my mother scurried into the kitchen. She returned with a frantic parody of a Christmas dinner. a pre-cooked turkey from the grocery store, still in its foil pan, and a bowl of instant mashed potatoes that looked pale and lifeless under the harsh glare of the bare overhead bulb. She arranged the sad meal on the small table with jerky, nervous movements, her hands trembling. The air at the table was thick enough to choke on. It was heavy, leaden with unspoken words and suffocating guilt. My grandmother and I sat side by side, a tiny, silent alliance in a vast ocean of deceit. Across from us, my father, Edwin, said nothing. He just kept pouring himself another glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, his eyes fixed on the cheap wine swirling in his glass, refusing to look at anyone. My mother, Marilyn, tried to fill the dead air with pointless chatter. She talked about the weather, how dry the winter had been. She mentioned old neighbors who had moved away years ago. Her words were like pebbles dropped into a deep well, disappearing without a sound, without an echo. I couldn't eat. The food on my plate felt like ash in my mouth. My fork was heavy in my hand, an impossible weight to lift. All I could do was stare at the faces of my parents, faces I had known my entire life, faces I had loved and trusted, and see only strangers. They were strangers wearing my parents' skin. With every tick of the clock on the wall, the tension coiled tighter, drawing all the air out of the room, like the breathless calm before a tornado touches down. And then it happened. In the dead center of that crushing silence, my grandmother Helena calmly placed her fork down on her plate. The small, sharp clink of metal against ceramic sliced through the quiet like a gunshot. She turned to me. Her eyes were still gentle, her expression soft, but the question she asked was as sharp and as cold as a surgeon's scalpel. "By the way, Alicia," she began, her voice even and measured. "How is the mansion? I sent the money 4 years ago for your parents to buy it for you. Are you comfortable there?" The world didn't just stop, it froze solid. Every molecule in the room seemed to lock in place. A roaring sound filled my ears as I slowly turned my head, looking from my grandmother's expectant face to my parents' terrified one. "The mansion is for me," I whispered, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. A jarring clang echoed through the room as my father's fork slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered onto the linoleum floor. My mother, her face now a ghostly white, began to stammer. Well, Alicia loves it, don't you, sweetie? It's... My grandmother didn't even glance at them. She cut through my mother's pathetic sputtering without raising her voice, her gaze locked on me, demanding the real answer. She held my stare, and in her eyes I saw that she already knew. She was just giving me the space to speak my own truth. My world, which had cracked earlier, now shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I took a shaky breath, the air burning my lungs. My voice, when it came out, was trembling but clear. "I don't understand, Grandma. I live in the barracks on base. I've never even had a key to that mansion." The silence that followed my words was a terrifying thing, louder and more profound than any scream. The gentle warmth in my grandmother's eyes instantly turned to ice. She slowly, deliberately, turned her head to face her son and daughter-in-law. "Edwin, Marilyn," she said. Her voice was low, but it carried an authority that made the air vibrate. "The money. The $1.2 million I wired 4 years ago. It was all for Alicia's house, a gift for her enlistment. Where is the money?" There was nowhere left for them to hide. Under Helena's unblinking, penetrating gaze, the lies crumbled. My father finally looked up, his face a mask of shame and defeat. They confessed. They admitted to taking the money, my money, and buying the magnificent mansion in Paradise Valley, putting the deeds solely in their own names. And when the confession was over, when the ugly truth was laid bare on the sad Christmas table, my mother tried one last, desperate defense. "I was just trying to protect the family's image," she cried, her voice cracking. "Do you have any idea what the pressure is like in Paradise Valley?" The excuse was so selfish, so appallingly shallow, that it stole my breath. It was then that a memory, sharp and painful, surfaced from the depths of my mind. a letter I had written from the exhausting, muddy trenches of basic training. I remembered sitting on my bunk, tired and homesick, writing to them about how I was saving every spare dollar from my meager army paycheck. I had told them I was hoping that, one day, I could afford a beautiful home just like theirs. The innocence of that hope, the purity of that dream, now felt like a cruel joke in the face of their calculated, predatory greed. My grandmother didn't yell. She didn't scream. Her voice remained chillingly calm, but each word she spoke was a hammer blow, driving the nails into the coffin of their lies. "So," she began, articulating every syllable with precision, "you let my granddaughter, a sergeant in the United States Army, a soldier who swore an oath to defend this country, live in a four-walled room in a barracks, while you used her money to live in luxury? To show off to your friends? To post your fake, happy pictures on social media?" She paused, letting the weight of her accusation settle. She turned her gaze to me, sitting there in stunned silence, a single, hot tear finally breaking free and tracing a path down my cheek. "You stole her future," Helena said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more power than any shout. "You are not just thieves, you are traitors." For the second time that night, my grandmother Helena placed her silverware on her plate. But this time, the sound wasn't a warning shot. It was a final verdict. The quiet clink echoed in the silent room like the fall of a judge's gavel. She looked directly at my parents, Edwin and Marilyn, who seemed to physically shrink in their chairs under her gaze. They looked like guilty children, stripped of all their bluster and arrogance. "I don't want to hear a single pathetic excuse," Helena declared, her voice as cold and hard as forged steel. "I only want to see action." She leaned forward slightly, her power commanding the entire room. "Beginning at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, you will begin the process of transferring the full, unencumbered title of the mansion in Paradise Valley to Alicia Collins. I am giving you exactly 1 week. If Alicia's name is not on that deed 1 week from today, my lawyers will file a suit against you both for felony fraud and misappropriation of funds. And trust me," she added, her eyes narrowing, "I have more than enough evidence to ensure you both see the inside of a prison cell." My parents said nothing. They couldn't. Their faces were a grotesque mixture of humiliation and pure, animal terror. The game was over. They had been checked and mated. My grandmother turned to me, and the icy fury in her eyes melted away, replaced by a gentle, profound tenderness. She reached out and took my hand, which was still trembling in my lap. "Let's go, my dear," she said softly. "There's nothing left for us in this place." She pulled me to my feet and led me straight to the door, not once looking back. As we walked out, I could hear a muffled sob from my mother, but it was the whisper from my father that would haunt me, a final twist of the knife in a night full of them. "That damn old woman," I heard him hiss to my mother. Everything was going so well. The words, full of venom and devoid of a single shred of remorse, slammed the door shut on any lingering hope I might have had for them. Helena didn't take me to a hotel. Instead, she drove us straight to Old Town Scottsdale, to a high-end steakhouse with dark wood paneling and soft lighting. She got us a table by the window, overlooking the street, which was beautifully decorated with twinkling Christmas lights and festive garlands. The world outside was celebrating, and for the first time that night, I felt like I could be a part of it. Helena ordered 2 glasses of expensive champagne. When they arrived, sparkling and golden, she raised her glass to me. "Merry Christmas, my warrior," she said, her eyes shining. "From this day forward, every day to come belongs to you." We clinked our glasses together. It was the first Christmas dinner where I felt truly seen, truly valued, and truly loved. We talked for hours, and I felt a decade of distance melt away as if it had never existed. After dinner, as we walked back to my truck, she made a request. "I want to see where you've been living," she said. "Take me to your base." The drive was quiet, comfortable. When we arrived, I led her through the sterile, impersonal hallways of the barracks to my room. It was a small cinder block cube, painted a dull, institutional beige. There was a single bed, a metal locker, a small desk, and a chair. It was the epitome of Spartan living. As Helena stepped inside, her eyes scanned the tiny space, and I saw tears well up. I thought she was crying out of pity for the bleakness of it all. I was wrong. She walked over to my bed and gently touched the wool blanket, which was folded with military precision into a perfect square at the foot of the mattress. She looked at the few medals and commendations I had pinned to a small corkboard above my desk. "This is real wealth, Alicia," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is honor, something your parents will never have." And with that, the floodgates opened. For the first time, I told her everything. I told her about the crushing loneliness, the constant pressure of being one of the few women in my unit, the bone-deep homesickness that never seemed to go away. She just sat on my simple, narrow bed and listened. And when I was done, she pulled me into her arms and held me, stroking my hair as I cried like a lost child. That night, she refused to go to a hotel. She stayed with me. I slept in my own bed, curled up in my grandmother's embrace, and for the first time in years, I felt a profound, unshakable peace. I was safer in that tiny, bare room than I had ever been in that grand, empty mansion. Just before we drifted off to sleep, she told me a story about her own past, about how, after my grandfather died, his family tried to push her out of the company she had helped build. They said a woman couldn't run a business, she recounted, her voice a soft murmur in the dark. They said I would fail within a year, but I proved them all wrong. She turned her head on the pillow to look at me, her eyes finding mine in the dim light. "Alicia, you must never let the words of others define who you are." Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Don't give them your consent, Alicia. Don't you ever give them that power over you again." Her words, spoken with the quiet strength of a woman who had fought her own battles and won, didn't just comfort me. They ignited something within me, a small, resilient flame of strength, flickering to life in the darkness. My grandmother stayed in Phoenix for exactly 1 week, and she transformed that week into a relentless, meticulously executed military campaign. She checked into a sprawling suite at the Phoenician, the luxurious resort nestled at the foot of Camelback Mountain, and turned its elegant living room into her personal command post. The mission was simple and non-negotiable: Operation Transfer. Every morning, she and I would meet with a team of Scottsdale's most formidable lawyers, their briefcases filled with irrefutable evidence: bank statements, wire transfer receipts, property records. My parents, Edwin and Marilyn, were not invited to these strategy sessions. They were summoned. Like low-ranking subordinates called before a commanding officer, they would arrive at the law offices, utterly defeated. The change in them was staggering. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. They didn't dare fight back. My father tried to bargain once during a meeting with Helena's lead attorney. I remember his pathetic, wheedling tone. "How about we just give her 50%, he suggested, forcing a weak smile. "She's a girl, after all. What does she need a house that big for?" The lawyer, a sharp woman in her 50s, didn't even blink. She simply slid a file across the table and said, "This contains the preliminary fraud report we've prepared for the district attorney. Shall we discuss 50% of the prison sentence instead, Mr. Collins?" He never tried to bargain again. My mother attempted a different tactic. She cornered me in the hallway after one of the meetings, her face streaked with tears. "You can't do this to me, Alicia," she whispered, grabbing my arm. "I'm used to this life, my friends, my clubs. Everything is tied to that house." Her plea was so transparently selfish it made me feel sick. Her tears weren't for our broken relationship. They were for her lost social standing. I simply pulled my arm away and walked on. Throughout that week, I was mostly a silent observer. I sat beside my grandmother, watching her operate with the calm, strategic precision of a 5-star general. I learned that true power wasn't about shouting or rage. It was about control. It was about knowing the facts, anticipating the enemy's moves, and executing your plan with unwavering resolve. The final day arrived. We all met at a sterile notary's office downtown. This was the last time I would face them this week. They looked like they had aged a decade in 7 days. My mother couldn't bring herself to look at me, her eyes fixed on the bland corporate art on the walls. My father, however, stared at me with an expression of pure, undiluted hatred. He saw me not as his daughter, but as his conqueror. The notary, a cheerful woman oblivious to the drama unfolding before her, slid the transfer documents across the table. When my parents picked up the pens to sign their names, to officially relinquish the symbol of their entire fraudulent life, I didn't feel a surge of victory. There was no joy, no sweet taste of revenge. There was only a strange, hollow emptiness. The quiet scratching of their pens on the paper was the sound of a final, irrevocable severance. Then came the heavy, satisfying thud of the notary's official seal pressing into the page. It was a sound of finality, the closing of a rotten, decaying chapter of my life. In that moment, I became the legal owner of the house I had been locked out of on Christmas Eve. It wasn't a triumphant victory. It was simply a fact that had to be enforced. A few days later, we were at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. My grandmother hugged me tightly at the security gate. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were clear and steady as she held me at arm's length, looking directly into my soul. "The house is yours now, Alicia," she said, her voice firm but full of love. "But more importantly, your life is your own. Don't you ever let anyone take it from you again. Live with strength, live with kindness, and build something beautiful from these ashes." She pressed a check into my hand. "Use this to remake the house in your own image," she instructed. "Make it your sanctuary, not theirs." I watched as she walked away, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. I stood there until her plane took off, a silver speck climbing into the vast, blue Arizona sky. A profound sense of loss washed over me, an ache for the ally I was losing again. But beneath the sorrow, there was something else. A deep, quiet reservoir of strength I had never felt before. I didn't go back to the mansion right away. I needed time. A week later, my leave was over, and it was time to return to my real life. I drove to Paradise Valley, this time with a heavy set of keys in my hand. I unlocked the massive front door and stepped inside. Everything was exactly as they had left it, impeccably clean, luxurious, and completely devoid of warmth. The faint, cloying scent of my mother's expensive perfume still hung in the air. I walked slowly from one cavernous room to the next, my boots echoing on the marble floors. I ran my hand over the cold designer furniture, the soulless, abstract art. All of it bought with my money. All of it a monument to their lies. I finally came to a stop in the center of the enormous living room, staring out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sparkling turquoise water of the swimming pool. And I began to cry. I cried for the naive girl who had been so excited to come home for Christmas. I cried for the family that had been shattered beyond repair. I cried for the profound, suffocating loneliness of standing in my very own home. But after the last tear fell, after the grief had washed through me, I stood up straight and squared my shoulders. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. 2 years passed. 2 quiet, transformative years. I served out the remainder of my contract with the Army and received my honorable discharge. Stepping out of uniform and into civilian life felt like taking my first breath in a new world. And the first act of that new life was a purge. I didn't do it with anger or ceremony. I did it with the calm efficiency of a soldier clearing a hostile space. I hired a consignment service and an estate liquidator. I systematically emptied the mansion of every last trace of my parents. The gaudy, oversized furniture, the closets full of designer clothes with the tags still on, the cold, soulless, abstract art they had bought to impress people they didn't even like, it all went. When they were done, the mansion was a cavernous, echoing shell. It was empty, but for the first time, it didn't feel cold. It felt clean. It felt full of potential. Slowly, carefully, I began to fill the void. I painted the stark white walls a warm, creamy white. I brought in simple, rustic wooden furniture that felt solid and real beneath my hands. I filled the windowsills with potted cacti and succulents, resilient little plants that thrived in the Arizona sun. And on the walls, where their meaningless art once hung, I hung framed photos of my real family, my brothers and sisters in arms, their smiling, sun-scorched faces looking back at me from dusty landscapes in faraway lands. I transformed that monument to vanity into a sanctuary, a home. There was one thing, and only one thing, that I kept. Tucked away in a corner of the formal living room was an old, slightly out-of-tune baby grand piano. It was the piano my father had used to teach me my first simple scales when I was a little girl, his large hands patiently guiding my small ones over the keys. It was a memory from a different lifetime, from a man who no longer existed. But I couldn't part with it. I kept it as a quiet testament to the fact that nothing, not even profound betrayal, is ever entirely black and white. My life plans changed, too. The dream of becoming an architect, of building beautiful structures, felt hollow now. My own broken foundation had taught me that the most important structures aren't made of glass and steel. They're the ones we build inside ourselves. One night, while scrolling online, I stumbled upon a TED Talk by a researcher named Brené Brown. She spoke about the power of vulnerability, not as a weakness, but as the birthplace of courage and connection. Her words resonated so deeply, they felt like they were rearranging my DNA. I realized my wounds didn't have to be a source of shame. They could be a source of strength, a bridge to understanding others' pain. The next day, I enrolled in the psychology program at Arizona State University. My new mission was clear. I would become a therapist specializing in helping veterans, my people, navigate the invisible minefields of PTSD and find their way back to a life of peace. My relationship with my grandmother became the anchor of my new world. Every Sunday, without fail, we would video chat. We talked about everything: my classes, her garden, the new recipes she was trying. Her face on the screen, her wise and loving voice in my ear, was the truest north on my compass. My parents tried to breach the perimeter a few times. Once, an email from my mother appeared in my inbox. It was a long, rambling tirade of self-pity and veiled accusations. 2 years ago, it would have shattered me. Now, I read it with a strange sense of detachment, calmly hit delete, and then blocked her email address. The small, quiet click of the mouse was the sound of a boundary being fortified, a declaration of my own sovereignty. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. I had friends from my classes, study groups that sometimes turned into pizza nights. I spent quiet weekend afternoons reading by the pool, the Arizona sun warm on my skin. I had learned how to be alone without being lonely. I had learned what it felt like to be truly free, to be the architect of my own life. It was a fragile peace, hard-won and precious. And I never took a single moment of it for granted. But peace is a fragile thing. It was a Tuesday night in late November. Finals were approaching, and I was hunched over my laptop at the kitchen island, surrounded by textbooks and highlighted notes, trying to cram a semester's worth of abnormal psychology into my brain. My phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen. It was my Uncle Holden. My heart seized in my chest. He never called this late. I answered, a cold dread washing over me. Alicia? His voice came through the line, trembling and strained with an urgency that terrified me. It's Grandma. She's very sick. The doctors. They say there isn't much time. He choked back a sob. She keeps asking for you, honey. She just keeps saying your name. You have to come to Vermont. Now. The world tilted on its axis. The quiet, peaceful sanctuary I'd so painstakingly built collapsed around me in an instant. The textbooks, the upcoming exams, the entire life I had created. It all faded into meaningless noise. The strongest woman I'd ever known, my hero, my savior, was fading. Before I continue, I need to ask you something. If you have that one person in your life who has been your rock, your protector, your Helena, please hit that like button for them. And in the comments, just type the name of your hero. Let's fill this space with the names of the people who make us strong. I didn't hesitate for a second. I slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing in the sudden, deafening silence of the house. I ran to my bedroom, grabbing a backpack and throwing in whatever clothes my hands could find. I had to get to her. I had to be by her side. The red-eye flight from Phoenix to Burlington, Vermont was the longest 6 hours of my life. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't read. I just sat there, pressed against the cold glass of the airplane window, staring out at the endless, inky blackness and praying to a god I wasn't even sure I believed in anymore. Please, just let me get there in time. Please, just give me one more day. My Uncle Holden was waiting for me, just past the security checkpoint at the small Burlington airport. The exhaustion was etched into the lines on his face. He pulled me into a hug, and I could feel the weariness and sorrow in his bones. It was the hug of a man who had been holding a lonely vigil for far too long. "She's been waiting for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I walked into her hospital room, and the air was stolen from my lungs. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. Helena, my grandmother, the woman who had always seemed as strong and immovable as the green mountains of Vermont, was now a fragile bird, a tiny, frail shape lost in a sea of white hospital sheets and a tangle of tubes and wires. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. But as her eyes fluttered open and found me, a spark of the old fire returned. A faint, weak light, but it was there. And it was for me. I stayed in Vermont for 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks became a lifetime. I slept on a lumpy vinyl sofa in the corner of her room, the constant beeping of the machines becoming the soundtrack to my days and nights. I only left when the nurses gently insisted I go get a real meal or take a walk. I read to her from books of poetry she loved. I told her all about my psychology classes, about my dream of helping other veterans. I became her hands and feet. I carefully spoon-fed her broth when she could eat. I wiped her brow with a cool cloth, and for hours on end, I just sat by her bed, holding her thin, papery hand in mine, memorizing the feel of it. Those days were a strange, bittersweet tapestry woven with threads of love and grief. The grief came in waves, watching her strength fade, seeing her drift further away from me with each passing day. But the love? The love was in the quiet moments, in the deep, unspoken connection that flowed between us. In this sterile, quiet room, we were compressing a lost decade into a few precious, fleeting weeks. My parents arrived a week after I did. Their presence felt like a violation of a sacred space. I was in the hallway getting a cup of coffee when I heard my father's booming, indignant voice. He was yelling at my uncle. "Why wasn't I notified sooner?" he roared, his voice echoing off the linoleum floors. I am her eldest son. My Uncle Holden, a man whose gentle nature I had always known, responded with a quiet strength that stunned me. "You were her son on paper, Edwin," he said, his voice calm but sharp as glass. "Alicia was the child of her heart. This was her wish. You have no right to be here and disturb her peace." The brutal truth of his words hung in the air, a final damning indictment of the man my father had become. The confrontation solidified my resolve. I would be a guardian at the gate, protecting my grandmother's final days from their toxic, self-serving drama. During one of her last lucid moments, her grip on my hand tightened ever so slightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the oxygen machine, "for not being there for you sooner." The unnecessary apology broke my heart. "No, Grandma," I whispered back, tears streaming down my face. "You were always there. I just didn't know it." Her eyes were clear, focused. "Listen to me, my warrior," she breathed, each word an effort. "Live a life of meaning. Don't let hatred poison your soul. But you must always be strong enough to protect yourself. Never, never let anyone walk all over you again." She took a shallow, rattling breath. "After I'm gone," she continued, "Holden will give you a letter. A private letter just for you. Read it when you're alone." She looked at me, and in her gaze I saw a universe of love, a lifetime of unspoken pride. "I love you, Alicia Collins." A week later, on a quiet December afternoon, it began to snow. Fat, fluffy flakes drifted down outside the window, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white. My grandmother woke up. She didn't speak. She just turned her head and watched the snow fall for a long time. Then she turned back to me. A small, peaceful smile touched her lips. "So beautiful, the snow," she whispered. And those were her last words. She passed away gently, like a snowflake melting into the earth, her hand still held firmly in mine. I laid my head down on the edge of her bed, and the grief I had been holding back finally broke free. It crashed over me like an avalanche, burying me in a cold, suffocating darkness. The one person on this earth who had loved me unconditionally was gone. The funeral was small and simple, just as she had wished. There were no hollow speeches from people who barely knew her. It was just me, Uncle Holden, and a few of her oldest friends. We took her ashes to the shores of Lake Champlain. Under a vast pale Vermont sky, we scattered them over the calm blue-green water, watching as they became one with the lake and the wind. She was free, and I was utterly, completely alone. The reading of the will took place the following week at my Uncle Holden's law office in downtown Burlington. It was a formal, somber space with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves that smelled of old paper and leather. The air was thick with a grief that felt entirely separate from the raw sorrow I held in my heart. I sat beside my uncle at one end of a large, polished conference table. My parents, Edwin and Marilyn, sat opposite us, their expressions a careful mixture of mourning and expectation. Just before my uncle began, my mother leaned across the table, creating a brief, false intimacy. I was her daughter-in-law after all, she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward Holden. If you get a large share, sweetie, you'll remember to take care of your father and me, won't you? The sheer audacity of it, the naked transactional greed disguised as a motherly plea, made me feel cold all over. I didn't respond. I just stared back at her until she retreated into her chair. Holden cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Before I begin, he said, his voice heavy, there is something you all need to know. It's something I myself only learned recently. He took a deep breath. 2 years ago, my mother quietly finalized the sale of the biotech firm she founded after Dad passed away. The final sale price was $1.2 billion. Absolute silence. The number hung in the air, seeming to suck all the oxygen out of the room. I felt a wave of dizziness. $1 billion? My grandmother, the woman who wore cardigans and baked her own bread, was a billionaire? I glanced at my parents. The feigned sadness had vanished from their faces. It was replaced by a single, terrifying emotion. Pure, radiant avarice. Their eyes were wide, gleaming with a predatory light as they stared at each other, the same hungry thought passing between them. My uncle unfolded the will, a crisp, multi-page document. This was written and notarized 2 years ago, immediately following the Christmas you came to visit Alicia. He said, giving me a significant look. He began to read in a steady, measured voice, each word landing with the weight of a hammer blow. He detailed several bequests to charities, trust funds for longtime employees, a generous gift to her alma mater. And then, he arrived at the heart of it. To my beloved granddaughter, Alicia Collins, he read, I leave my entire real estate portfolio in Sedona, Arizona, 50% of my remaining stock holdings, and the sum of $500 million in cash. He paused, letting the number settle. My mother gasped. Holden continued. All the remainder of my estate, including all other assets, I leave to my son, Holden Collins. He carefully folded the document and placed it on the table. That concludes the last will and testament of Helena Collins. For a moment, there was only the sound of my mother's ragged breathing. What? What about us? She stammered, her voice a reedy whisper. Holden looked directly at his brother, his expression a mixture of sadness and steel. Edwin and Marilyn Collins, he stated, his voice flat and final, are not mentioned in the will. In that instant, the civilized man I had known as my father ceased to exist. In his place, a monster clawed its way to the surface. His face turned a blotchy, furious red, and he shot to his feet, the legs of his chair screeching against the polished floor. What? He roared, the sound exploding from his chest. That old woman was insane. I am her eldest son. He lunged across the corner of the table, moving with a speed I'd never seen in him. He grabbed Holden, his own brother, by the collar of his suit jacket, shaking him violently. "This was you," he screamed, his face inches from my uncle's. "You and that little bitch, you manipulated her." His arm shot out, his trembling finger pointing at me, his eyes bulging with a terrifying, primal rage. "You ungrateful snake. You poisoned her against me. You stole everything that was mine." Marilyn was shrieking, trying to pull him back, but it was useless. He was a man possessed. The dignified law office had become a battlefield, and I just sat there, frozen, my blood running cold. I was paralyzed with a horror so profound it felt like it was stopping my heart. I was staring at the man who had raised me, and I didn't recognize him at all. All I could see was this ugly, screaming stranger, his face twisted by a greed so powerful it had turned him into an animal. And I remembered my grandmother's words, "Be strong enough to protect yourself." I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just met his hateful gaze, my stillness a silent act of defiance against his chaos. Holden's paralegal had already called security. Two large men in uniforms entered the room and professionally, forcefully, separated my father from my uncle. They escorted both of my parents toward the door, my father still shouting obscenities, my mother weeping hysterically. Just before they were forced out, my father twisted around and locked eyes with me one last time. "This isn't over," he bellowed. The heavy office door slammed shut, leaving behind a sudden, ringing silence. My uncle, shaken but resolute, straightened his tie and smoothed the front of his jacket. His face was etched with a deep, familial sorrow, but his eyes were firm. He walked over to a large black safe in the corner of the room, spun the combination dial, and opened it. From inside, he withdrew an old, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a circle of dark red wax. "This is for you," he said, his voice returning to its normal, gentle tone. He handed it to me. My mother's instructions were very clear. I was to give this to you only after everything was finished. I took the letter, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the brittle paper. It felt heavy in my hand, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this was more than just a letter. This was my grandmother's final weapon. After returning to Phoenix, I spent 3 days in the quiet solitude of my new home. The cream-colored envelope from my grandmother sitting untouched on the coffee table. It felt too sacred to open, a final conversation I wasn't yet ready to have. On the 4th day, I finally sat down, took a deep breath, and slid my fingernail under the brittle red wax seal. My hands trembled as I broke it. Inside, there was a handwritten letter and a thick, professionally bound dossier. I unfolded the letter first. Her elegant, familiar script filled the pages, a voice from the past speaking directly to my heart. "My dearest warrior," it began. "If you are reading this, then it means your father has shown you his true nature. I am so sorry for the pain he has caused you, but you must understand. His greed is a bottomless pit. He will not let you go. He will come to you, first with sweet words and false apologies, and then with threats. Do not be afraid. I have prepared a shield for you." She went on to explain that the dossier contained 2 decades of meticulously gathered evidence of my father's shady business dealings, his tax evasion schemes, the partners he had cheated. It was proof she had been quietly collecting for years, originally to protect the family estate and to shield my Uncle Holden from Edwin's recklessness. "Your father," she wrote, in a line that would change everything for me, "is a weak man, terrified of his own emptiness. He has spent his life trying to cover it up with expensive things. Don't hate him, Alicia. Pity him. But never ever let his weakness destroy you." The final line was her battle plan for me. "This dossier is not a weapon for revenge," she wrote. "It is a shield to protect your peace. Use it wisely." Just as she had predicted, they came. 3 days later, I saw their silver Mercedes pull up on my security camera feed. They didn't come to the front door. They didn't ring the bell. My father walked right to the side gate leading to the pool, used an old key to unlock it, and strolled into the backyard as if he still owned the place. "Just come on in like we own the place," I heard him say to my mother through the speaker, his voice thick with an arrogant entitlement that made my blood run cold. Remembering my grandmother's words, I took a deep, steadying breath, walked to the sliding glass door, and opened it. They stepped inside, my mother forcing a smile that was more like a grimace, my father surveying the sparse, clean space with a critical eye. "Well, you've certainly cleaned the place up," he said, the compliment dripping with condescension. "A bit empty, though. You'll need some money to decorate it properly. Your mother and I can help with that." They settled onto the sofa, the one piece of new furniture I had bought, and began their performance. They spoke of mistakes and misunderstandings. They spun a tale of how family should always stick together. My mother began to cry, her crocodile tears timed for maximum effect, lamenting how they would be ostracized from Scottsdale society, how their lives were ruined. Then my father got to the point. "500 million is an obscene amount of money for a young woman," he said, his tone shifting from paternal to predatory. "Just sign over 100 million to us, a small fraction. We can start over. Consider it your filial duty." I said nothing. I just looked at him, my silence a wall he couldn't breach. His voice grew sharp, laced with impatience. "Are you just going to sit there, ungrateful child, after everything I've done for you?" I slowly, deliberately, shook my head. No. That was it. The mask shattered. He shot to his feet, his face contorting with the same ugly rage I had seen in the lawyer's office. "I am your father. I gave you life. I have a right to that money. If you don't give it to me, I will sue you. I will drag your name through the mud and tell the whole world what kind of monster you are." His threats were loud, his fury a tangible force in the room. But I wasn't afraid. I felt a strange cold calm settle over me. I remembered Helena's words. Pity him. As he raged, I quietly stood up, walked to the coffee table, and picked up the thick, black dossier. I turned back and placed it on the table in front of them with a soft, definitive thud. A heavy, chilling silence fell over the room. My father's tirade died in his throat. They both stared down at the dossier as if it were a venomous snake. My father reached out with a trembling hand and opened it. The first page was a copy of a fraudulent tax return. The next was a sworn affidavit from a former business partner he had cheated out of millions. They flipped through the pages, their faces draining of all color, moving from flushed red to stark white to a pasty, terrified gray. I let them absorb the reality of it for a long moment. Then I spoke. "Grandma said this wasn't a weapon for revenge," I said, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly steady. "She said it was a shield to protect my peace." I met their horrified eyes. "If you ever contact me again, by phone, by email, in person, if you ever trouble my life in any way, this shield will be delivered to the IRS and the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office." They looked up at me, and all the anger was gone from their eyes. All that was left was raw, abject terror. They were finally, completely, powerless. "Now," I said, my voice remaining even, "I need you to leave my house." They scrambled to their feet like frightened animals, not saying a word, not looking at each other. They walked silently to the front door and let themselves out. I followed them, and as the door swung shut, I turned the deadbolt. The soft, metallic click of the lock sliding into place was the sweetest, most liberating sound I have ever heard. After that final confrontation, a quiet, profound peace settled over my life. It wasn't just the absence of conflict, it was the presence of a deep, internal calm. The fear was gone. The anger was gone. All that remained was a feeling of lightness, of release. I threw myself into my studies and graduated from Arizona State with top honors in psychology. I never saw my parents again. I heard through my uncle that they had sold their chain of fitness centers and moved to Florida to live a quieter, less conspicuous life. I felt nothing when I heard the news. No anger, no sadness, not even pity. They had simply become ghosts, faded figures from a past that no longer had any power over me. The unbreachable boundary I'd set had held, and my peace was secure. I knew that the immense fortune my grandmother had left me was not just money, it was a responsibility. It was a tool. Remembering her words, build something beautiful from these ashes, and guided by my new mission in life, I used the majority of my inheritance to establish the Helena Collins Foundation. It became a nonprofit unlike any other, with a singular, focused purpose to support military veterans, especially women, in their difficult transition back to civilian life. We provided everything I had once desperately needed: safe transitional housing, free and confidential mental health counseling, educational scholarships, and job training programs. And the mansion in Paradise Valley, once a cold symbol of my rejection, became our headquarters. I transformed its cavernous, lonely rooms into counseling offices, meeting spaces, and a warm, welcoming community center. The place that was once the source of my deepest pain became a sanctuary for hundreds of others. It was the ultimate act of reclamation. My story, once a private tragedy, became a public source of inspiration. I began accepting invitations to speak at veterans events and conferences across the country. I never told my story to elicit pity. I told it as proof. Proof that from the deepest wounds, you can find the strength to rebuild. Proof that it is not only possible, but necessary to set boundaries to protect your own life. And proof that you can redefine the meaning of family on your own terms. I became the beacon I'd once so desperately searched for in the dark, hoping to light the way for other soldiers who had lost their way. In one of my first group therapy sessions, a young Marine, just back from a brutal tour, was talking about the crushing loneliness she felt, how disconnected she was from the world she had fought to protect. When she finished, her eyes filled with tears, I looked at her and said the only thing that mattered. "I understand," I told her, my voice soft. "I've been there too." In that moment of shared vulnerability, I felt my own scars transform, not into something ugly to be hidden, but into a bridge that connected my heart to hers. The story ends as it began on Christmas Eve, several years later. I'm 32 years old now, and the woman who looks back at me from the window pane is strong, serene, and at peace. Tonight, the mansion is no longer dark. It is blazing with light, not the garish, ostentatious lights of social climbing, but the warm, welcoming glow of genuine community. Inside, the sound of laughter and cheerful conversation fills every room. A festive but informal Christmas party is in full swing, filled with veterans and their families, their children chasing each other around a beautifully decorated tree in the great room. The air smells of pine needles and hot apple cider. I stand by the large living room window, looking out at the desert garden, now bathed in the soft light from the house. I'm holding a warm mug of cider, its spicy steam warming my face. On the wide windowsill in front of me, I carefully place a small bouquet of fresh white chrysanthemums, my grandmother's favorite flower. I look out into the quiet, peaceful night and whisper to the stars. "I'm doing okay, Grandma," I say, a small smile on my lips. "I'm carrying on your legacy." And I know, with every fiber of my being, that her true legacy was never the money. It was the promise she embodied, a promise I now spend my life trying to fulfill. That no soldier should ever have to feel abandoned. That a true home is not a building, but a place where you are safe and cherished. And that even from the darkest, coldest night, a new day will always, eventually, dawn. And so, that is my story. It began in a place of darkness and betrayal, but with the love of one good person, it found its way into the light. My grandmother taught me that our deepest wounds don't have to be the end of our story. They can be the beginning of our purpose. If my journey has resonated with you, I hope you'll consider subscribing and joining our community here. Please share this story with anyone who might need to hear that they are not alone, and that from the ashes of the past, a beautiful new life can always be built. Thank you for listening.